When I first moved into Callahan Apartments, it wasn't much. The walls were yellowed from years of cigarette smoke, the floors creaked with every step, and the heating unit coughed more than it breathed. But for me, it was freedom. It was mine. A place that smelled like burnt coffee and detergent instead of my father's aftershave or the constant noise of roommates who didn't care if you slept or starved. The building sat on a narrow street just a few blocks from downtown. Old brick, ivy crawling up the sides like it was trying to hold the place together. There were 8 units total, stacked in a faded L shape around a gravel courtyard. Mr. Callahan, the landlord, lived on the ground floor, apartment 1A. You could always tell which one was his. Polished window frames, trimmed ivy, and a porch light that never burned out. He ran the building himself, and everyone said he was fair but firm. I never had to test the firm part until now. It had been 2 months since the cafe let me go. Seasonal slowdown, they'd said. Like caffeine ever went out of season. I'd applied everywhere. Grocery stores, diners, even a call center, but nothing stuck. Every morning I'd walk past the same, now hiring signs that seemed to mock me, knowing the managers inside had already tossed my resume. Rent was due last week. I told myself I'd find something by now. When I got home that Thursday evening, the hallway was quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like it was holding its breath. My mailbox was empty, but there it was. A white envelope taped to my apartment door, perfectly centered, with my name printed in block letters. I didn't need to open it to know. Still, I did. Notice of eviction. 2 months overdue. Failure to remit payment by end of week would result in termination of lease and removal of tenant property. Signed neatly at the bottom, Michael Callahan. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I'd be sick. I stood there, just staring at the paper, feeling the world tilt under me. The hallway light flickered once and went out, leaving only the sound of an upstairs faucet dripping like a slow clock. 2 months ago, I was a guy who could pay his bills and buy the occasional six-pack. Now I was a name on an eviction notice. I sank down onto the floor, back against my door, letter still in hand. The envelope trembled slightly, maybe from the draft, maybe from me. I kept reading it, as if somewhere in the fine print there'd be a hidden mercy clause. If tenant is really trying, please disregard. There wasn't. After a while, I folded it carefully, slipped it into my pocket, and went inside. My apartment was small but clean. A second-hand couch, a chipped kitchen counter, and a mattress on the floor. Everything I owned could fit into 2 duffel bags. That thought scared me more than the eviction itself. I paced for a long time trying to think. Maybe if I talked to Mr. Callahan, explained things, he'd give me a little more time. He wasn't cruel. I'd seen him carry groceries for old Mrs. Carter in 2B, fix a leaking pipe at midnight for free. But I'd also seen him post notices on doors without a hint of hesitation. Still, what choice did I have? I pulled on my jacket and walked downstairs. The courtyard smelled faintly of rain and cut grass. The porch light outside his apartment glowed through the fog, steady and yellow, like always. I hesitated, then knocked. It took a moment before I heard his footsteps. Then the door opened. Mr. Callahan stood there in a dark gray shirt, sleeves rolled up, glasses perched low on his nose. He was taller than I remembered, with hair graying at the temples and eyes the color of worn wood, calm but unreadable. For a man who'd lost his wife 3 years ago, according to the gossip upstairs, he looked like someone who'd learned to live with quiet. "Evan," he said, voice steady. "I figured you'd come by." I tried to smile. "Yeah, I got your note." He nodded once. "I'm sorry it came to that. I need a little more time," I said quickly. "I've been looking for work. I've got some interviews lined up. If I could just—" He held up a hand, not unkindly. "You're 2 months behind. I've been patient, but the property taxes aren't." "I know," I said, the words catching in my throat. "I know. I don't have anywhere else to go." He studied me for a moment, not with anger but with something quieter, maybe pity, maybe calculation. His expression barely moved, but there was a flicker in his eyes that made me feel exposed, like he could see the exhaustion behind my forced calm. I can't promise anything, he said finally. But I'll give you until Sunday to figure something out. Sunday. My voice cracked. That's 3 days. He sighed softly. It's more than the law requires. He wasn't wrong. For a second, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the wind whistling through the courtyard, carrying the faint creak of someone's window upstairs. I wanted to hate him, to accuse him of being heartless, but he wasn't. That was the problem. He was too calm, too measured. The kind of man who believed rules existed for a reason, even when they hurt. All right, I said finally, forcing myself to nod. Thank you for the extra time. He gave a short nod in return. Good night, Evan. And just like that, the door clicked shut. I walked back upstairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. The walls seemed thinner than usual. I could hear the faint hum of a TV from next door, someone laughing faintly in the background. I wondered if anyone else here had ever been in my position. When I got inside, I sat on the couch, still wearing my jacket. My hands felt cold even though the radiator hissed weakly in the corner. I stared at the eviction notice again, laying it flat on the table this time. 2 months behind. 3 days left. No savings. No job. I tried to make a plan, any plan. I could borrow from a friend, except most of them were just as broke as I was. Maybe I could sell my laptop, or the old guitar I hadn't played in years. But even then, it wouldn't be enough. The city outside my window glowed faintly with neon signs and passing headlights, but it all felt distant, untouchable. There was a time when I loved that sound. The pulse of life, the proof that I wasn't alone. Tonight it just reminded me how small I really was. I thought about Mr. Callahan, the way he'd looked at me, the weight behind his silence. He didn't enjoy doing this, but that didn't mean he'd stop it either. I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to block out the gnawing thought that maybe this was what rock bottom felt like. Not a crash, just a slow, quiet slide until you realized the ground was gone. Around midnight, I turned off the lights. I lay on my mattress staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the fridge, the faint creaks of the building settling. It was strange. This place had always felt safe to me, even in its flaws. Now, it felt like it was already letting go. I tried to imagine packing up my life. 2 duffels. Maybe 1 suitcase if I could borrow one. The thought made my chest tighten. I didn't want to leave. I wasn't ready. When the radiator clicked off and the room went cold again, I whispered into the dark. Not to anyone, not even to God, just to myself. There has to be another way. And somewhere below, through the thin floorboards and the hum of the pipes, I thought I heard footsteps pause outside my door, and then fade away. The next morning, sunlight poured weakly through my blinds, turning the room a dull amber. I hadn't slept much, just drifted in and out of shallow dreams that all ended the same way. Me standing outside, holding my bags, watching someone else move into my apartment. The notice was still on the table. Sunday felt both too close and too far away. I made myself coffee, more for the ritual than the taste. I didn't even have milk left, just bitter black liquid and an ache in my stomach. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. Sitting around wasn't going to change anything. I decided to try one last time, not to beg, I told myself, but to reason. Maybe if I showed him I was trying, he'd see I wasn't just another freeloader. When I reached his door, the porch light was off for once. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the wood, before finally knocking. "Come in," came his voice from inside, low, calm, and unreadable. I stepped into his small office, which doubled as his living room. It smelled faintly of cedar and paper. Old furniture filled the space. A sturdy oak desk, a shelf of neatly labeled binders, and a framed photo of a woman with a soft smile. His late wife, I guessed. Mr. Callahan sat behind the desk, reading something. He looked up when he saw me and set the papers aside, folding his hands slowly. "Evan," he said, "I figured you might." I stood there awkwardly. "I just wanted to talk about the rent. I know I'm behind, but I've got some leads. A diner on 8th is hiring, and—" He cut me off gently. "You've said that before." "I know," I said quickly, "but this time it's real. I just need a few more weeks, maybe until the end of the month." I'll get you everything I owe. I swear. He sighed, not annoyed, but tired. The kind of sigh that came from someone who'd had to be the responsible one too many times. Evan, he said quietly, I've given too many chances to too many people. I can't afford another. The words hit harder than I expected. You mean you won't even try? You'd rather just throw me out? It's not about what I want, he said, leaning back slightly. It's about what I can keep standing. Something in his tone, steady, resigned, made me angrier than if he'd shouted. I crossed my arms, trying to keep my voice even. You don't understand. I've got nowhere else. I do understand, he said, his gaze steady on me. More than you think. For a moment, neither of us moved. The clock on the wall ticked softly, filling the silence. He looked at me in a way that felt both analytical and personal. Eyes tracing the tension in my shoulders, the worry on my face. Then something shifted. Paused too long. A breath that lingered. He looked down at his desk, then back up again. There's another way you could stay. My stomach twisted. What do you mean? He hesitated, the lines around his mouth deepening. His jaw tensed once, then he spoke carefully, like every word cost him something. I could clear your balance, he said. Forgive the rent. You'd keep the apartment. I frowned. What's the catch? He met my eyes for a moment. Steady, quiet, unflinching. One night, he said. With me. For a second, I didn't understand. My brain refused to translate it. And then, all at once, it did. The air left my chest. You're serious? He didn't flinch. I am. I stepped back, heat flooding my face. You can't just. I know. He interrupted, voice low. I know how it sounds. I shouldn't have said it. But you did, I said sharply. He looked away, rubbing the bridge of his nose like he was ashamed. You're right. It's wrong. But so is watching someone drown when you could pull them out. I'm not proud of the thought, but it's there. I didn't know what to say. Anger flared in me. Not just at him, but at myself for being the kind of person who'd made this possible. A man who could be bargained for. So that's what I am to you? I asked quietly. A body for rent? His expression faltered. No, not that. Never that. He exhaled, slow and heavy. Forget it, Evan. Forget I said anything. But I couldn't. The words hung in the air like smoke. Visible, choking, impossible to erase. I left without another word. I think he called my name once, but I didn't stop. My hands shook as I climbed the stairs back to my apartment. Once inside, I locked the door, leaned against it, and tried to breathe. My pulse hammered in my throat. The room felt too small, like the walls were closing in. I hated him for saying it. I hated myself for not slamming the door in his face. And worst of all, I hated the part of me that understood why he said it. Not out of cruelty, but out of some twisted loneliness neither of us wanted to name. I spent the rest of the day pacing. Every time I thought the anger had burned out, it sparked again. How could he think I'd agree to something like that? How could I even consider it? But as night came, and the sky turned from gray to black, the panic started to return. The practical kind. The cold kind. Sunday. 2 days left. Where would I go? I thought about the shelters downtown, the waiting lists, the noise, the fear. I thought about calling my father, the silence that would follow if I did. And then, without meaning to, I thought about Mr. Callahan again. The way he'd looked when he said it. Not leering, not smug, but almost broken. Like he was offering a piece of himself he knew I'd never want. It wasn't desire, I realized. It was desperation wearing another face. Maybe for both of us. I tried to sleep, but the thought wouldn't leave me alone. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again. Calm, sad, and too human. I turned on the light. Midnight. The city outside was silent except for the hum of distant traffic. I told myself I was only thinking hypothetically. I told myself I'd never do it. But when I imagined packing my bags, dragging them out into the cold, standing in some shelter line, the thought cracked something inside me. Maybe it wasn't just about survival. Maybe I wanted to understand him, the man who offered something so wrong, yet somehow felt less cruel than the rest of the world. The clock ticked past 1. I sat up, heart thudding, staring at the door. The letter on my table fluttered slightly from the draft, as if reminding me what I stood to lose. I stood, grabbed my jacket, and before I could talk myself out of it, I walked downstairs. The hallway was dim, shadows spilling from the stairwell window. I paused at the bottom step, staring at the light under his door. He was still awake. My hand hovered above the wood for a long moment. Then, finally, I knocked. The sound echoed softly down the quiet hall, and for the first time, I wasn't sure whether I wanted him to answer or to let me walk away. The knock sounded softer than I meant it to. For a moment nothing happened, and I almost turned back. Then the latch clicked. Mr. Callahan stood in the doorway, a dim lamp behind him painting the room in gold and shadow. He looked the same, worn but composed. Only now there was uncertainty in his eyes, as if he wasn't sure whether to be relieved or ashamed that I'd come. "Evan," he said quietly. I swallowed. "Can we talk?" He stepped aside, wordless, and I entered. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain. His living room was neat to the point of loneliness. Books aligned, a single mug on the counter, no clutter except for an old blanket draped across the couch. We stood facing each other, both searching for words. The silence felt fragile, like glass between us. "I shouldn't have said what I did," he began finally. "It was wrong." "I know," I said, voice rough, "but you meant it." He looked down at the floorboards, jaw tightening. "I did, and I hate that I did. I'm not that kind of man, or at least I didn't used to be." I waited. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. "Since my wife passed, the days just blur. I come home, fix what's broken, pay the bills, and then sit here listening to the pipes hum until morning." I thought I was fine with the silence, until I realized it was starting to answer back. He gave a small, humorless laugh, then met my eyes. I offered something ugly because I didn't know how else to ask for company. The admission knocked the anger out of me. What was left was confusion and pity that felt dangerously close to understanding. "I didn't come here for that," I said. "I know. But I didn't come to leave either." He exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and disbelief. "You don't owe me anything, Evan." "I know," I repeated, though the words didn't steady me. My pulse was loud in my ears. He gestured toward the couch. "Sit." I did. He stayed standing for a moment before lowering himself into the armchair opposite me. For a long while we just talked about nothing at first. The leaking roof in 2B, the bakery that closed on Main Street. He asked about my job search, and I told him about the rejections, about the way people look at you differently once you're desperate. "I used to think people stopped seeing me after she died," he said quietly. "Now I think they just see through me." There was no script for this kind of honesty. Felt too real, too raw. "I'm sorry," I said. He shook his head. "Don't be. It's just the truth." Silence again, but softer this time. The kind that doesn't demand to be filled. When he finally stood, it wasn't with authority but uncertainty. "If you'd rather go, I'll understand." Something in the way he said it, almost hopeful that I would choose myself, made my chest ache. I stood too, hands shaking slightly. "I'll stay," I whispered. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and turned off the main light, leaving only the lamp by the window. Its glow stretched across the room, turning the air into amber haze. What followed wasn't a bargain. Not anymore. It was two people trying to remember how to be touched by another human being without flinching. He moved carefully, always giving me space to pull away. I didn't. At some point he brushed a lock of hair from my forehead. The gesture was so ordinary, so small, that it undid me more than any grand act could have. My eyes stung, and I had to look away. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "For what?" "For everything that led you here." I shook my head. "You didn't cause it." "Maybe not, but I'm still part of it." We both knew he was right. When he reached for my hand, his was trembling. Not from lust. There was none of that feverish edge, but from fear, from wanting to do something right for once. I let him hold it. His thumb traced small circles over my knuckles, steadying both of us. The clock ticked quietly. Outside, rain started again, tapping against the window like someone too polite to knock. He turned slightly toward me. "If you ever tell me to stop, I will. No questions. No debt. Understand?" I nodded. I understand. Everything after that blurred into moments. His hesitant smile when I didn't pull away, the warmth of his hand against the chill of mine, the way neither of us seemed to know what to do with the closeness we'd both avoided for years. We didn't say much. Words would have broken the fragile peace. The night unfolded slowly, almost awkwardly, as if we were both learning how to exist without the armor of loneliness. At some point I realized I wasn't afraid anymore, just sad and strangely grateful. When the lamp finally went out, the room settled into quiet breathing and the steady rhythm of rain. I felt the mattress shift as he lay beside me, careful, distant, like he was afraid his presence might still scare me off. I turned slightly toward him in the dark. "This doesn't erase the rent," I said softly. "I know," he answered. It wasn't about that anymore. For a while we listened to the storm. His breathing was slow, deliberate. I could tell he was awake, maybe thinking the same thing I was, that we'd crossed a line neither of us planned to, yet somehow it didn't feel like trespassing. His voice came low, almost a whisper. "Thank you for staying." I didn't know how to answer, so I didn't. Instead I lay there, staring at the faint light leaking through the curtains, feeling the space between us shrink until our hands found each other again. No promises, no apologies, just the quiet thrum of two people who'd been alone too long, finally daring to share the same silence. When dawn came, the rain had stopped. The first streaks of light stretched across the ceiling. Neither of us moved. We weren't touching anymore, not really, but our breathing was still in sync. It felt less like ownership and more like surrender, to peace, to exhaustion, to something unnamed that had begun to grow in the cracks between guilt and grace. I didn't know what it meant. I only knew it was the first morning in months that didn't feel empty. And that frightened me most of all. Morning came quietly, pale light bleeding through the curtains, cutting across the floor in narrow stripes. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The sheets were warm, the room smelled faintly of cedar and rain, and the steady sound of breathing beside me reminded me that this wasn't a dream. Reality followed a second later, heavy and disorienting. Mr. Callahan stirred but didn't move closer. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, expression unreadable. I could tell he was already building walls back up in his mind, one brick at a time. The air between us was thick with all the things neither of us knew how to say. "I should go," I said finally, voice low. He nodded, slow and restrained. "All right." I got dressed in silence. My shoes were still damp from the night before. I didn't look at him again until I was at the door. He was sitting up now, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like a man waiting for a verdict. "Evan," he said softly. I froze, half-turned. His lips parted like he wanted to say something. An apology, maybe, or an explanation, but no words came. Instead, he just exhaled and looked away. I left before he could try again. The hallway felt colder that morning. My steps echoed too loudly, every sound bouncing off the thin walls as if the whole building knew. Inside my apartment, everything looked the same, but it felt different. I made coffee out of habit, but it tasted like metal. I showered, changed, and sat by the window pretending to look at the street below. The truth was, I didn't know what I felt. Shame sat somewhere deep in my chest, heavy and sour, but it wasn't alone. There was also a strange warmth, not quite comfort, but something like it. The memory of his hand on mine, the quiet way he'd breathed, the gentleness I hadn't expected. It wasn't lust I kept replaying. It was the humanity of it. Still, I couldn't face him. For the next few days, I avoided his side of the courtyard entirely. I slipped out early in the mornings, came back late, pretending I had errands or interviews. Most of the time, I just walked until my legs ached. Yet somehow, his presence lingered. A few times I caught faint sounds through the floorboards. The scrape of a chair, the closing of a cabinet, his footsteps passing by my door. Once, I opened it to find a small paper bag hanging on the knob, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a note that simply said, "You left these behind." I hadn't. That was how he communicated now, through small acts of decency he didn't expect me to acknowledge. Fixing the dripping faucet outside my apartment. Tightening the banister on the stairs. A quiet, wordless truce. Still, the silence between us stretched longer with each passing day. Then came the gossip. I was coming back from a job application at a diner when I overheard Mrs. Carter from 2B talking to someone in the courtyard. They were standing by the mailboxes, voices low but clear. "He's been like that since his wife died," she was saying. "Barely speaks to anyone. Keeps everything bottled up. Cold man, that one." "Doesn't surprise me," the other replied. "You can see it in his eyes. He's not made for company." I slowed my pace, heart thudding. Cold. Reclusive. Unloving. Was that what he'd been with me? The thought unsettled me more than it should have. Because if he really was that cold, then what had that night been? A lapse? A transaction he regretted? Or something he'd wanted to feel but couldn't admit? The uncertainty gnawed at me. I tried to throw myself into finding work. Anything to keep busy. I got a few interviews, some false promises, and more rejections. I told myself it didn't matter, that I just needed to survive until the next thing came along. But every time I walked past his apartment, my stomach tightened. One night, about a week after it happened, a thunderstorm rolled in. The wind rattled the windows, and the lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The building fell into darkness. For a moment I sat frozen on the couch, listening to the rain hammer against the glass. Then I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped into the hallway. Halfway down the stairs, I saw another light, a faint golden beam cutting through the dark. Mr. Callahan stood at the fuse box, sleeves rolled up, flashlight wedged between his shoulder and chin as he worked on the panel. When he noticed me, he hesitated. "Power's out again," he said, voice almost swallowed by the storm. I nodded, unsure how to stand, how to breathe. "Need help?" He gave a tired smile. "Not unless you're an electrician." We stood there for a few seconds, the light between us flickering like it couldn't decide who to illuminate. I realized how long it had been since I'd looked him in the eyes. There were shadows under them now, and lines that hadn't been there before. I heard what they said. I blurted without meaning to. His hands stilled. "Who?" "The neighbors. About you. About being cold." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his tone was quiet, measured. "They're not wrong." "I don't believe that," I said. He gave a short laugh. Not mocking, just sad. "You should." He shut the fuse box gently, as if not to wake something sleeping. "I've spent years trying not to feel too much. It's easier that way. Cleaner." "And that night?" I asked before I could stop myself. "Was that clean too?" He turned, meeting my gaze head-on. For once, there was no distance in his expression, just exhaustion and honesty. "No," he said softly. "It was a mess, but it was real." The storm roared outside, thunder shaking the walls. For a heartbeat, the flashlight's glow caught the edge of his face, the faint scar near his temple, the sadness tucked behind his calm. "I don't regret it," he said finally. "I regret what it meant for you." "It didn't feel like just a deal," I whispered. His shoulders stiffened. "It wasn't." Lightning flashed, and for a second, the room was lit bright as day. We both blinked against it, but neither moved away. Then the light went out again, and the building fell into soft, humming darkness. "I didn't know how else to reach you," he said quietly. "You kept everyone at arm's length, same as I did. I shouldn't have crossed that line, but I think we were both standing on it already." I didn't know what to say. The anger I thought I still had melted into something else. Grief, maybe, or relief. When the lights finally came back on with a loud pop, he turned back to the fuse box and muttered, "There we go." But I could see his hands shaking slightly as he closed the panel. I didn't thank him, didn't apologize either. We just stood there, the new silence softer now, less like avoidance and more like something waiting to be understood. As I turned to head back upstairs, I heard him call my name. Evan. I stopped. He hesitated, searching for the right words. Sleep well, he said finally. Simple but weighted. I nodded, barely whispering back, You too. Back in my apartment, I lay awake listening to the storm fading outside. The guilt hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. What lingered now wasn't regret. It was the ache of something unfinished. For the first time since that night, I didn't feel entirely alone. After the storm, the days settled into something quiet. Not peace, but the soft hum of it. The air in the building felt different, less heavy. For the first time since everything happened, Mr. Callahan and I didn't avoid each other. Started small. A nod in the courtyard. A polite morning as I passed his door. Then one afternoon, he knocked gently on mine holding a cup of coffee. Power's back on, he said with a faint smile. Figured you might need this more than I do. I hesitated before taking it, fingers brushing his briefly. Thanks. He nodded once, as if that word alone carried more meaning than either of us was ready for. After that, it became habit brief check-ins that turned into conversations. At first, it was all surface level, weather, tenants, job applications. But soon the pauses between words grew shorter. The air between us felt less like something to escape and more like something to share. Sometimes I'd find him fixing a railing late at night or oiling the hinges on the front door. I'd linger nearby, pretending to help just to stay. He never told me to leave. He'd hand me a screwdriver or flashlight without saying a word, like he understood exactly why I was there. One evening, while tightening the bolts on the courtyard gate, I finally asked what had been gnawing at me for weeks. Why me? He looked up slowly, as though I'd asked him something ancient. What do you mean? You could have asked anyone else for help around here. Or anything else. My voice faltered. Why me? He set down the wrench and leaned against the gate, thinking for a long moment before answering. Because you looked at me like I was still human. The words hit like a gentle blow. The kind that didn't hurt but left a mark. I didn't realize I wasn't, I said quietly. He gave a half smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. People don't say it, but they stop seeing you when you've lost something they can't fix. My wife. She was the last person who looked at me like a man instead of a memory. I didn't know what to say, so I said the only thing that felt true. You don't seem invisible to me. He looked at me for a long time, and in that look was a lifetime of silence breaking apart. After that, something shifted. We started having coffee together on the porch in the mornings. Some days we didn't talk at all, just sat there watching the world move. Tenants heading to work, mail trucks rolling by, the ivy shifting in the wind. Other days, he told me stories about his wife, how she used to leave notes in the fridge, how she'd hum when she cooked, how the house went quiet the day she didn't come home. I realized then that he didn't crave company so much as proof he still belonged to the living. One night, while I helped him replace a light fixture in the hallway, I caught him staring. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, in a way that felt like recognition. I froze for a second, feeling that same pull I'd tried to bury. Something wrong? I asked. He blinked, shaking his head slightly. No, just, you remind me what quiet used to feel like before it turned into loneliness. I didn't respond right away. My throat was too tight. Do you ever think about that night? I asked finally, voice barely above a whisper. His hand stilled on the ladder. Every day. Me too, I admitted. But not the way you think. It's not about the offer or the rent. It's how it felt. Being seen. Wanted. He looked down at me, eyes soft, full of something between guilt and gratitude. That's not what I meant to give you, Evan. I know, I said. But maybe it's what we both needed. The silence stretched between us again. But this time it wasn't awkward. It was alive. He stepped down from the ladder, standing close enough for me to feel the warmth of him. His voice was low, almost careful. I've tried not to think about you that way again. I told myself it was just circumstance, that it couldn't mean anything. Did it work? I asked. He let out a quiet laugh. Not even a little. That laugh broke something open in me, the wall I'd built between shame and wanting. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched his arm. Just that. Simple contact. But he didn't pull away. His hand came up, hesitated in the air, then rested gently over mine. The warmth of it felt like forgiveness. "Evan," he said softly, as if saying my name might change its meaning. "I don't want this to be another mistake," I said. "Then don't let it." We stood there in the dim hallway, the new light flickering above us, painting our shadows close together on the wall. The quiet hum of the building filled the space around us, and for the first time, it didn't sound lonely. He brushed a thumb across the back of my hand, his touch almost reverent. "I don't have much to offer anymore. Not money, not promises. But I can be honest." "That's enough," I said. He smiled then, small, unsteady, real. The kind of smile that belonged to a man learning to feel again. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was both of us, meeting halfway like the world would tip if we didn't. The kiss wasn't perfect. It wasn't even practiced. It was hesitant, uneven, full of breath and uncertainty. But it was real, chosen, not owed. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the still air. "I thought I'd forgotten how this felt," he whispered. "What?" "Hope." I closed my eyes, letting the words settle inside me. Outside, the night was calm. The storm had passed, leaving the world smelling of wet earth and renewal. Inside, it felt the same, as if something in both of us had been quietly rebuilt. We didn't need to define it. There were no promises, no declarations. Just the understanding that what began as a mistake had turned into something that resembled healing. For the first time, I didn't feel like I owed him anything. And for the first time, he didn't look like a man who'd lost everything. We stood there until the light above us stopped flickering. The hallway bathed in steady, warm glow. His hand stayed in mine, no longer trembling. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be about debt or desperation. It would be about choice. About the fragile, terrifying act of being seen and choosing to stay. The winter passed quietly, melting into a pale spring that smelled of wet earth and second chances. Months had gone by since that night in the hallway, and the world had begun to move again. Slowly, softly, like it was learning a new rhythm. I found work at a small bookstore downtown. Nothing glamorous, but steady, honest. I liked the smell of old paper and coffee drifting through the aisles. The pay was enough to catch up on bills, though I never had to worry about rent anymore. Not because of any deal, but because I paid it now willingly, proudly. I hadn't moved out. I didn't want to. The building had changed too. The ivy outside grew thicker. The walls seemed to hum with a quieter energy. The tenants smiled more often. Even Mrs. Carter said Mr. Callahan had lightened up, which coming from her was practically a miracle. As for him, Michael, he was still the same man in many ways. Calm, reserved, still fixing things that didn't need fixing. But sometimes, when no one was looking, I'd catch glimpses of something else. A softness that had been buried too long. A quiet joy that lived in the corners of his eyes. Our days fell into an easy rhythm. I'd come home from work to find him in the courtyard, trimming the ivy or painting the old railing. He'd glance up, that familiar half-smile forming, and I'd join him, no words needed. Evenings were spent in small domestic rituals. Cooking together, sharing dinner, reading on opposite ends of the couch. He teased me once about my cooking. "You measure everything," he said, peering over my shoulder. "You're supposed to feel it, not calculate it. That's why yours comes out uneven." I shot back, bumping his arm with mine. He laughed. An actual, unguarded laugh. And I realized it was the sound I'd been waiting to hear for months. Sometimes, when the nights stretched long, we'd sit on the porch in silence, listening to the hum of the city. His hand would find mine, casually, naturally, as if it had always belonged there. No words, no expectations, just presence. There were still moments of hesitation, ghosts of what had started this between us. Some nights I'd lie awake and think about that first offer, that desperate bargain we both pretended never happened. But the weight of it had changed. It wasn't shame anymore. It was a reminder of how far we'd come from it, how something broken could still grow into something whole. One evening in early summer, I was cleaning out the drawer of my old desk, the one I'd used for job applications, rejection letters, and sketches of plans that never happened. Beneath a pile of receipts and an expired bus pass, I found it, the eviction notice. The paper had yellowed slightly, the ink faded, but the words were still sharp. Notice of termination of lease. For a moment, I just stared at it, remembering the cold hallway, the panic, the fear of losing everything. Then I looked around the room. The same four walls, now filled with warmth, laughter, and something resembling peace. I walked into the living room, where Michael was sitting by the fireplace, reading with his glasses slipping down his nose. "What's that?" he asked, seeing the paper in my hand. I didn't answer. I crouched beside the fireplace, folded the letter once, twice, then fed it to the flame. It caught quickly, curling at the edges, glowing bright before crumbling to ash. He watched quietly, the firelight painting his face in soft gold. When the last piece disappeared, he said, "Guess that's officially paid in full." I smiled, turning toward him. "It was never about the rent, was it?" He shook his head. "No," he said softly. "It never was." The clock ticked gently in the background. The room smelled faintly of smoke and pine. He reached out, brushing a speck of ash from my sleeve, his fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. For the first time, I saw him not as the man who'd once held my future in a single envelope, but as someone who had been just as lost as I was. Someone who had found his way back through the same door he'd almost closed. Later that night, we sat on the couch together, a record playing faintly from the corner. It was one of his old jazz albums, the kind with soft horns and slow rhythm. He leaned back, arm resting along the back of the couch, eyes half closed. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, not accusing, just curious. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But then I remember how it felt when I had nowhere to go." I glanced at him. "And how it feels now." He smiled, eyes still closed. "And how does it feel now?" "Like home," I said simply. He opened his eyes then, looking at me for a long time. "You know," he said softly, "when I first moved into this building, I thought it would be a place to hide, a shelter from the noise. Did it work?" "For a while," he said, "until you moved in upstairs." I laughed quietly. "You make that sound like a bad thing." It wasn't. The record reached the end, the soft crackle of static filling the silence. He leaned closer, resting his forehead against mine. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet acknowledgement of time, of change, of everything that had brought us here. We stayed like that for a while, the fire burning low, the world outside fading to nothing but the soft rustle of leaves. At some point, I realized I was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the guilt, for the doubt, for the reminder that it all began wrong. Those ghosts had lost their power. What was left was real, fragile, and alive. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't meant to be, but it was ours. He said I could stay if I did something. I thought he meant one night. Turns out he meant to stay for good. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that staying could be something beautiful. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this one blue heart. Every view, comment, and like helps me keep creating stories that remind us what it means to be seen, wanted, and loved, even when it starts in unexpected ways. Do you think what began as a desperate deal between Evan and Mr. Callahan could ever become true love? Or would the past always linger between them? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every one of them.